At this time, we filed a motion late yesterday to release any recordings, transcripts, reports, etc. of the grand jury. But the other part of our motion also was to get a declaration of rights for our client, which would also apply to any other grand juror that was a part of this process. Specifically, we wanted to know from the court system if a grand juror would have the right to speak freely without fear of prosecution, persecution, condemnation, torment, etc., about their experience as a grand juror in this proceeding.
Grand jury proceedings are secret. Prosecutors come in, they present their case to the grand jury, and then the grand jury sits and decides what should be done. Should there be indictment? Should there not? And that's it. That's usually it. We don't hear anything about what happened inside the grand jury. We just hear what the grand jury decided. Well, tomorrow, that's going to change. The audio from last week's grand jury testimony in the Breonna Taylor case will be released to the public after one of the grand jurors complained about what was presented. Court TV crime and justice reporter Julia Janae is here to help us break it all down. Let's start with, how did this happen?
Ted, this came after a motion. This grand juror is responding to the proceedings that happened last week, 2 to 2.5 days worth of what the Attorney General's office presented to this group, and they have retained an attorney. That grand juror is anonymous. Their identity has not been released, but their attorney that you heard there speaking is filing this motion on their behalf, requesting that everything be released. And they also want to make sure that their client is going to be protected going forward. And this comes on the heels of a lot of demands for the grand jury information to be released. We know that announcement came from Attorney General Cameron last week, saying that there would be no charges directly for the death of Breonna Taylor. And the one indictment had to do with bullets that went into an adjacent home that was near Taylor's. So there have been a lot of calls for exactly what happened when that grand jury was listening to these details. And now we know that tomorrow at noon, the Attorney General is going to be placing that file, or by noon rather, will be putting it in this file so that it will become public.
So a grand juror goes through the process, then seems like they come out, they see all of the uproar, and they think they're upset about it. Why did the grand juror come forward?
Well, that attorney that they retained, Kevin Glogauer, explained that once they did see not necessarily just the uproar, but also the details that they didn't know during the proceedings, and also the way the Attorney General presented those charges to the public. They felt that there were some differences, some discrepancies, that they felt that there needed to be more transparency. Here's how the attorney that's representing that anonymous juror explained it.
It's not really about changing the narrative. It's about opening it up to a more full truth for everybody to see. You know, the court system's an interesting place because they talk about the truth, nothing but the truth, and we're going to get it all out there. In fact, I think Mr. Cameron even stated it, search for the truth. Sometimes you don't get all of that because of these certain rules unless somebody steps up and takes action. And again, our client felt a strong conviction to step up and take action to see if they could help get all that information out. So I think it probably does change some narratives, but that's going to be, something that people consider on their own.
Of course, these again are typically secret proceedings, so the idea that this is going to be released to the public really is huge news, Ted.
Yeah, it's a game changer, and as the lawyer said there, maybe the system does need these types of changes. It's you wonder if this is going to open up floodgates for other controversial cases. Well, we want to hear what the grand jury was exposed to. Bottom line, it sounds like the lawyer was critical about how the AG's office has presented the charges in this case.
That's actually been a public criticism and a big question at the heart of this. So we know that Officer Brett Hankinson was the one officer, he's now a former officer, who was charged and indicted in the Breonna Taylor death investigation. And that was for wanton endangerment. It's a Class D felony. It carries a sentence of up to 5 years in prison. And there have been a lot of questions about whether or not this was the only charge that was presented to the grand jury, or whether or not they had a list of charges, whether they were able to take everything in this investigation, everything that happened in that apartment, all of the officers who were involved and their actions, and whether or not the grand jury then deliberated on which charge applies. Here's how Attorney General Cameron responded to that specific question last week in a press conference.
The response is that the grand jury was given all of the evidence, presented all of the information, and ultimately made the determination that Detective Hankinson was the one to be indicted. Grand jury proceedings are secret, and so I'm not going to get into the specifics of details about that proceeding. What I will say is that we presented all of the information, and they ultimately made a determination about whether to charge. In this instance, they decided to indict Detective Hankinson.
Again, that was last week. Since then, this week, the Attorney General is saying that he will comply with what the judge is ordering in this case, that he will make the recordings of that grand jury proceeding public, but that is specifically just going to be the testimony. That's what it is limited to. This was a proceeding that took about 2.5 to 3 days long. That's a little bit long when it comes to a grand jury proceeding, but that is what is expected to actually be released. And there are some calls for more information, for the transcripts and for the investigative files that were actually presented to this grand jury.
Yeah, and apparently the mayor is thinking about letting some files out from an independent body that did follow up on it. How did they get around the rule here?
Right, the mayor, yes, is planning to release or thinking about releasing that. As far as the rule, there's a grand jury handbook, and they are sworn in at the beginning that they will keep the details of what goes on during that grand jury proceeding private. They can talk about the actual breakdown of how it happens, encourage others to serve on grand juries. But as far as how this attorney filed that motion to get around that secrecy, here's how he explained the 2 instances where Kentucky law allows this to happen.
There's a very narrow and short rule that applies here. It's RCR 5.24 subsection 1, if you all want to look it up on your own, that states the grand jury secrecies. And what it does state in the rule is that anybody who's in the room during the proceedings is sworn to secrecy, with only 2 exceptions in writing. One being that the court at any time at their discretion can order the release of those proceedings. That's happened. The other exception within the rule is, again, the accused has a right to that information. And at that point, if you read the rule, it also states that the accused through counsel or presumably pro se can divulge certain information as a part of their own investigation or any subsequent hearings or trial on that action. So the message that gets out there right now that these are secret and they're never to be talked about is inaccurate. There are ways that it comes out. And I think the dangerous precedent to set is more of a chilling effect of not letting the public in on what's happening and trying to distort that level of secrecy to the extent that you're, at least by appearance, not putting all of the truth out there.
Still a question, Ted, of what all the truth will mean, whether these recordings alone will be sufficient for what this grand juror wants to release, and whether there'll be other grand jurors who will want to come forward once it's more specific from the judge, whether or not they will have that protection.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to listen to those recordings, the audio from that grand jury proceeding. Again, it is the testimony, so it's unclear whether or not it's going to be the Attorney General's presentation, opening, etc., or if it'll just be literally witness testimony. We'll wait and see, and of course, we'll be there ready at noon to gather it, and we'll have it all for you tomorrow night. Julia, Janae, thank you. Still ahead.